Now the French are protesting by the millions. They're flooding the streets, cars are burning, streets are being blocked because their president is increasing the retirement age to 64 and they are just not having it. The French president says it's absolutely necessary due to the inflation in the Eurozone, because of the debt accumulated in the pandemic and the bad demographics of the French society. He's never talking about one big reason, however, which I believe may be the true reason for his urgency, which is Africa. Now, to be more precise, 14 African countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, which are absolutely vital to the French economy as we know it. I'll explain all the details in a second, but before that, let me explain to you in 30 seconds how the French pension system works. Now, the French pension system comes in the usual 3 pillars, which we all know. The first 2 ones being mandatory forms of provision, and the third one is private and optional for those who want and can afford it. What makes the French system very unique, however, is the 42 different pension schemes depending on occupation. Well, there's different benefits and retirement ages in those. For instance, workers for the National Railway Society, the SNCF, can retire as early as 56 years of age. Policemen in general can retire as early as 57, and the President Macron just thinks we're gonna abolish it all. It has no space anymore. We are going to get rid of all of those. Obviously, this creates a lot of resistance. Now, what do these 14 countries have to do with the French pension system? Well, as I explained or mentioned, they are very, very vital and essential for the survival of the French economy. So much so that the former French President Mitterrand once said that without these African countries, there will be no future for France in the 21st century. The whole connection is historical. We have to go back to the times of the French Empire. Now, the colonialization of Africa by the French started as early as about the 17th century, but did not peak until the 19th century as a result of industrialization. Now, after World War II, however, and when France was weakened and the spirit of independence would blow over these countries, Algeria, as the first African country, started to truly fight for their independence, and a war broke out between Algeria and France in 1954. It lasted until 1962 and resulted in complete independence for Algeria. This had a very large blood toll attached to it, however. About 1.5 million Algerians died in the process, according to Algerian estimates. Now, other African countries, they wanted independence from France also, but they didn't want to go to such a bloody war like the Algerians for it. So they, with the French, made certain agreements, post-colonial agreements basically, which would grant these countries formal independence, but it came attached to all kinds of strings. Now, first of all, the French would say, look, we have built such a big amount of infrastructure, we have invested so much in your countries, we've built up industry and medical facilities and schools, and now you want independence, now you're gonna have to pay us reparations for that. They also kept a military presence in these countries. They were the ones controlling and printing the money, the colonial franc, which is the CFA, which nowadays is still around. It's just the C is now for community and not for colonial anymore, but it's pretty much still the same thing if we're honest. Now, France controls and prints the money for 14 sub-Saharan African countries. With that, of course, comes a huge influence over these countries' economies. By the way, if you like this kind of content, make sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up so it can spread to more people. Thanks very much. Now, inside of Africa, anti-French sentiment is basically growing by the day. Especially the younger generations are sick and tired of this kind of exploitation, and they no longer want to tolerate it. But also the officials are pushing back against the French in the meantime. Here we have an interview, or I should say, just a speech, a little bit of a speech of an African diplomat. She is a diplomat of the African Union, and she used to be a permanent diplomat to the United States. Some people say that what she said here, what I'm going to show you, is what actually got her fired.
When the colonizers were leaving the continent between 1958 and 1961, France did something that was just downright terrible. Allow me to highlight a few of the items in the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. Today, France is taking out of Africa, Francophone Africa, over $500 billion. All your minerals discovered, yet to be discovered, France has the first right of refusal. All the contracts, big contracts, private and public, French companies have the first right of refusal. In addition, you will deposit 85% of your bank reserves with the Minister of Finance. The French minister will invest that money in the French stock exchange under the French name. You may or may not know the returns. They were also told that if you need any military equipment, you can only purchase it from France. That France will have military presence in your own country and can invade you without notice should they feel French interests are being violated.
But also inside of Europe there is growing criticism. For instance, by Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who a couple of years before she was elected Prime Minister, openly criticized France on television about this kind of policy. Let's have a look.
Questo è un bambino che lavora in una miniera d'oro in Burkina Faso. Il Burkina Faso è una delle nazioni più povere del mondo. Per il Burkina Faso, che ha l'oro, la Francia stampa moneta coloniale. In cambio pretende che finiscano nelle casse del tesoro francese il 50% di tutto quello che il Burkina Faso esporta. L'oro che questo bambino si infila in un cunicolo per tirare fuori finisce per lo più nelle casse dello Stato francese.
Now, not everyone was happy with Meloni's comments, of course. Apart from the French, who were outraged, the BBC deemed it necessary to conduct a fact check of Meloni's claims. In this article you can see here, they corrected Meloni, stating that it was not 50% of the exports of Burkina Faso that would go to the French treasury, but 50% of the foreign exchange. They also cited that the French treasury would withdraw from the Western African region, which in essence is not in effect as of now. There are plans to create a Western African currency called the ECHO, but until this project can be realized, a lot has to be achieved, since hardly any of the countries seeking to participate fulfill the economic criteria to join this zone. CFA countries in general do not perform well, even for African standards. In addition to that, the BBC claims that the participation in the CFA is voluntary and the countries could leave whenever they wished. This may be true on paper, but it is wishful thinking at best and an outright lie at worst. First of all, these countries participating in the CFA are not democracies. Here you have the CFA zones next to a picture of the World Democracy Index. As you can see, these countries are all slightly authoritarian up to complete dictatorships. Second, there have historically been very negative consequences for the leaders of these nations if they ever dared to go against French interests. We talk about assassinations, coups, or direct French military interference. The French military has intervened in Sub-Saharan Africa basically all the time. For the leaders of these countries it was clear: do as the French wish and be protected and get rich while selling out your country, or go against France and risk your life. France is losing ground in these countries, however. The French military presence is over, declared Macron, and to make things worse for the French, the Russians are beginning to gain influence in the region. Macron stated that France will not compete with Russia in an outdated race for natural resources. And certain African leaders are no longer afraid to tell the French president to his face to take a hike.
Our perspective has not to be what the French taxpayer decides to do with whatever surpluses that they have in France. They're welcome. But this continent, with all that has happened, is still today the repository of at least 30% of the most important minerals of the world. Those energies, we want to have those energies working inside our countries.
So did you see that? Did you see that? Basically what he said is, yeah, we are happy, you know, if you offer us your help, but we have to learn to stand on our own feet. And Macron had this Houston, we have a problem face. All right. Because what he actually said, the Ghanese president, what he said was, look, Frenchie, we actually want to get you out of here. This was the true message. This is the true message, and Macron absolutely understood this. Now, Ghana is not one of those 14 CFA countries. Ghana is actually one of the 2 economic powerhouses in Western Africa together with Nigeria. Now, if Ghana is openly talking to France like this, it sends a clear signal to its neighbors. All right? So this is why it's a huge threat. So Macron has traveled like 40 times to Sub-Saharan Africa, trying to reshape the whole relationship between the French and the African nations, with very mixed results. Actually, he knows he's losing ground. He tried to paint the whole house of imperialism in a new color, but it just doesn't really work. And his comments about the French military going out of Africa, and his comments about they're not going to compete with the Russians in an outdated race for resources, those comments are basically a testimony to the fact that he realizes that France is losing these countries. So the French, they can protest all they want. It will not help because the money needs to come from somewhere. So even if Macron failed, even if he got ousted from the seat of the president, even if this was the case, sooner or later these reforms will come, and they will come down hard, and they will not be the last ones. Trust me. So that being said, guys, we are at the end of today's video. If you like this kind of background information, you can also check out the video that I made about the war in Ukraine. First part is about Andrew Tate and his arrest. The second part is about the war in Ukraine and all the causes. Or this video that I made about the Nord Stream incident. And that being said, as always, take care, guys. See you next time.